So we're starting to chip away at the final few races of the season. We've got the North American leg, then the South American bit, and then we go to the Middle East to finish things off, which has somewhat become traditional in this new sort of mega packed bumper season that we have these days. But even though we're getting close to the end of the season, there are still some unanswered questions regarding who's going to be driving where. Mercedes has got Russell and Antonelli. Ferrari has Hamilton and Leclerc, and Hamilton in red is still a weird thought to me because I'm so used to seeing him in some variation of silver. Aston has got Stroll and Alonso because, well, Stroll's not going anywhere, is he? And McLaren will keep Lando and Oscar. Haas will have an all-new lineup with Behrman and Ocon, and that looks interesting because Behrman's been showing some decent things as a super sub. And Alpine will have Gasly and Jack Doohan. Then you've got Williams that has Alex Albon and Carlos Sainz locked in, which is an ambitious plan for the future it seems, and it will show what Albon is actually like now he's got an experienced teammate alongside him. Although, Colapinto has been giving him a good run already, much more than Sargent or Latifi ever did. So this leaves 3 teams where things haven't quite been officially confirmed. Well, officially they've been confirmed in one case, but it still leaves room for things to change, if you follow me. You've got RB, Toro Rosso, AlphaTauri, whatever you want to call them, who have an open seat, and that's really going to be open to a select bunch of drivers because it's the sort of academy team, if you want to call them that. The other one is Sauber, and that's the one where really anybody could go, but it's only one seat, and there's about 5 people in the running for it. All of this comes after the unique situation the sport had at the start of the year, where every driver on the grid started 2024 in the same place they'd finished 2023. It's quite an interesting thing to note because at least one person makes a move within the sport or out of the sport at the end of every season. However, 2 drivers lost their drive in the middle of this season, those 2 being Logan Sargent, who has moved aside for Franco Colapinto, and Daniel Ricciardo, who left to much despair from the fanbase after he had, quite frankly, underperformed. The latter was replaced by Liam Lawson, who is basically doing his audition tape for the senior Red Bull team. But at the time of writing, there appears to be no confirmation as to who will be there next year in that second Toro Rosso seat. Colapinto, Magnussen, Zhou, Bottas and Ricciardo are the 5 drivers that are being left out in the cold. Although if social media photos are to be believed, Ricciardo will not be back, as much as that might upset people further. So once you exclude Ricciardo, you've got 4 drivers basically fighting for that final Audi, Sauber, whatever you want to call it, seat, and Bottas is really the only one that's in contention for it. Bottas has been in discussions with Audi, but reports are that he's pushing for a better pay packet. At the same time, Sauber will still be Sauber in 2025, transitioning to Audi properly in time for 2026. So there is also the fact that it's both Sauber and Audi that will need to make the decision instead of just Sauber. Bottas would be another experienced pair of hands next to Hülkenberg through 2025, and if he stays on for 2026 and a little bit further, then that is still doable, given that Bottas is still 35 and has 2, maybe 3, maybe even 4 years left if someone wants to keep him around, as opposed to Hülkenberg, who will be 39 next year. Also, what Bottas has that Hulk doesn't is experience working with the other German team on the grid in Mercedes during their dominant years, and has got cars onto the podium. But there is another name that has been floating around, maybe because it's out of hope rather than anything else, and that's Mick Schumacher. Following his disastrous 2 years with Haas, Mick was set aside for, ironically, Hülkenberg. There are reports coming from Germany that there is a lot of anticipation for Mick being signed for Sauber/Audi, as the thinking is an all-German lineup would be a good way of doing things, much like Mercedes did on their return in 2010 with Rosberg and the Michael. However, while Mattia Binotto knows Mick, he's not being considered as a strong candidate, and is not being considered as strongly as Bottas is. That's going to get some people talking, isn't it? Schumacher or Bottas in that second Sauber? Do you go for experience, or do you take a punt on the guy with the famous surname? And Mick has already been bandied around as a replacement for Sargent this year, but Williams wanted to promote from within instead of going with Mick, who is currently Mercedes reserve driver and racing for Alpine in the WEC. When the speculation of him going to Williams was being thrown around, James Vowles said that Mick wasn't special and that he didn't have the superstar power about him that would have justified a phone call to Toto to see what it would take to get him in. And that comment upset a lot of people, and Vowles did later apologise for those comments, due to it being quite a misguided thing to say. But if Audi doesn't consider him a strong option either, then some might be saying that Vowles was right. But he still probably should not have said it. But 2 other drivers' names have entered the chat at this point, Gabriel Bortoleto and Franco Colapinto. As mentioned, Colapinto has been impressing in that Williams, despite being in 7th place in the F2 standings before he switched to Formula 1 after Sargent's dismissal. In the time he's been in Formula 1, he's scored 5 points and is ahead of Ocon in the standings. But it has to be said here that they're equal on points. But Colapinto's best result is 8th, while Ocon's best is 9th, and that's why Colapinto is ahead. But given that he was thrust into that car with very little prep, while someone like Liam Lawson got around a month to get ready for his first outing, well, first in nearly a year, it's an incredible showing already, and he has been giving Albon a run for his money too. There has, according to the race, been some chats between Sauber and Williams regarding Colapinto, given that he won't be with the team in 2025 because Sainz will be moving in. So unless something can be worked out, it will be a year on the sidelines and maybe getting something for 2026. Bortoleto, meanwhile, is currently the F2 points leader, but it's a slim points lead, just 4.5 points ahead of Red Bull up-and-comer Isaac Hadjar, who will be in contention for the vacant RB seat depending on what Red Bull decides to do with him, but we'll get to that in a bit. But that said, the top of F2 has been pretty competitive, with Bortoleto, Hadjar and Zane Maloney all at the top, and Maloney will be in Formula E next year. The issue that comes with Bortoleto is that he's a McLaren Junior prospect, and Audi won't want to be in the business of having the kid on loan, nor are they going to want to function as a driver development stable like how Williams has been for Mercedes recently, or Haas to Ferrari. As with Colapinto, releasing either of those two young drivers to drive for Sauber/Audi, who have been struggling hard all season and rooted to the bottom of the standings, that will cost Audi a lot of money, and the want for a driver to go to a team doing so badly is going to be slim. Although, you could argue that beggars can't be choosers. It has to be said that at the time being, those drivers are looking unlikely. Bottas is well and truly the favourite to be signed up at this point. Which, makes sense. Bottas has experience and is a race winner. Hülkenberg also has experience, and if both stay on for 2026, then that might leave Audi in a more stable spot, as the 2026 car will be designed and developed around those two drivers, rather than two new drivers that might not get along with it. At the same time, two drivers over 35 in a team that's going to be partly run by one of the biggest motoring manufacturers in the world, that's a gamble in itself. But there's actually two gambles they can take. Do they take experience and safe hands, but they also have one, maybe both drivers well over the hill? Or do they have the experienced guy next to a younger one that's been shown that already he's been able to just drop in and go? But that runs the risk of the so-called difficult second album. No guarantee that Colapinto, whose audition tape has been glowing, will be able to continue into 2025 at the same level. But as I say in these videos all the time, answers on a postcard. And if you're wondering where that term actually comes from, because I do say it quite a lot, it goes back to the old days before the internet when you were entering competitions on TV. Basically, they would ask a question like, what country do we live in? Is the answer A, Great Britain, B, France, or C, an umbrella? And you'd write the answer with your name and address on the back of a postcard and send it in, and they'd pick a winner. Although you later find out that these competitions were all rigged. Allegedly. It's a bit like the Blue Peter cat. It was like the public wanted to name it Socks, but Blue Peter had already decided, and the BBC had already decided, they're going to name it Cookie, or something along those lines. But then again, it's not the biggest scandal that ever hit Blue Peter, is it? Autosport, meanwhile, raised a valid point. Colapinto or Bortoleto would be a future plan that they should probably invest in. In turn, Bortoleto has been largely anonymous this season, because Red Bull product Isaac Hadjar, Kimi Antonelli and the already mentioned Colapinto have all been courted by their respective academy teams, with Antonelli and Colapinto moving up to Formula 1 in one way or another this year. Bortoleto went from last to first at Monza, and might be even further ahead in the standings if not for being punted off by Hadjar in the sprint race in Melbourne and then his hydraulics failing in the feature. Oh, and his manager is Fernando Alonso, so he'd have even more guidance available to him than most. But those three have to be the main contenders: Bortoleto, Colapinto and Bottas. Mick is an outsider, but at the same time the likes of Theo Pourchaire shouldn't be counted out. At the same time, Sauber said back in December that the decision should be made in a matter of weeks, so we should expect it either at the Mexican Grand Prix or in Brazil, or in between. Or maybe just after Brazil. But speaking of Mexico, we're now onto the Red Bull side of things. It's been no secret that since the drop in Red Bull's performance, one of the big talking points of the season, because Red Bull hasn't won a single race since Canada, sprint races accepted, Perez has simply been outclassed by Verstappen. And yes, Verstappen is the far superior driver, like how Hamilton was to Bottas, Schumacher to Barrichello and Hakkinen to Coulthard. But while Verstappen is able to have the car hovering around or inside the top 3, Perez has been nowhere. Now currently Perez sits 8th behind Hamilton and Russell, who are in arguably much worse cars, and Hamilton and Russell have both won races this year. Mostly through opportunity taken when presented, but still you have to be in it to win it. Perez hasn't been on the podium since China, his best result being 4th in Miami, but in the races he's finished since, it's been a mixture of 6th, 7ths and 8ths. Whatever changed on that Red Bull, he doesn't like it. Something asymmetric braking. Now I'm not saying that's the reason that they've gone backwards over the course of the rest of the season, I'm just predicting the comments. And Perez is partly key to what happens at AlphaTauri, Toro Rosso, or whatever we're calling them these days. If Lawson goes through the final 5 races consistently outperforming Tsunoda, as he did already at the US Grand Prix last weekend, there's a very real possibility he could be in the Red Bull seat next year, and then maybe Hadjar gets moved up from Formula 2, whether he wins it or not. Part of the reason Ricciardo was brought back was basically to do this, but it all fell apart when it turned out that Perez wasn't doing particularly well, and at the same time, the person that was supposed to be there to replace him, if the time came, wasn't exactly making a convincing case for being moved up. So there's 2 ways it can go, really. The first way is that Lawson destroys Tsunoda between now and the final round in Abu Dhabi, and then Perez gets either demoted or moved out entirely, where he's going to be out of a drive for at least the next 12 months. Or Lawson is kept on in the Toro Rosso seat all through 2025 and then moved up for 2026 when Perez's contract expires. And this allows Lawson to come up after spending more time as the apprentice, and then Hadjar comes up afterwards. But if Hadjar wins Formula 2, then he's out of a ride anyway, because if he finishes 2nd, he can only spend another year in Formula 2. Yeah, it's a bit of a mad one, isn't it? But knowing there's a decent amount of young drivers available is promising. The problem is, there aren't enough seats to go around, so they're going to have to take whatever they can get. It doesn't matter where that seat is, it doesn't matter how good or terrible the team is, beggars can't be choosers. Like Bortoletto. He's not getting in at McLaren because of Oscar and Lando being there, so he'll have to move along if he wants to race in Formula 1 next season or in 2026. And there's also Colapinto, and what happens with him at Williams will depend on what happens to Sainz. If Colapinto wants to race for Williams, he's going to be waiting until at least the end of 2026, as Sainz is on a 2-year deal and has options for 2027. But that's all going to depend on what Williams wants to do, what other seats are available, and so on and so forth. And that's the thing with Formula 1. You can't plan ahead because things can change in an instant. And if you hold out for a seat, it's a risky gamble, since that seat you've been looking for might go to somebody else and you'll just be left in the dark. It's a lottery sometimes. And Lawson isn't exactly safe in that Red Bull program either, but he's safer than the others, that's to be sure. But Lawson did make a convincing case on his return to Formula 1 on Sunday. He didn't just score points, but he scored 2 points while Hulk also scored points, and for those 2 teams it's a battle for 6th in the standings. With Colapinto finishing in 10th and then Magnussen behind the Williams, it meant that Toro Rosso are now just 2 points away from Haas in the Constructors. Could they overtake them? It is doable, but the problem with Toro Rosso at the minute is that Tsunoda hasn't scored points since Hungary, but at the same time, Haas's points have largely come from Hülkenberg, but he'd been on a bit of a dry spell as well, not scoring between Hungary and Singapore. But the other thing with Lawson, as Motorsport magazine mentioned in their review of his performance at the weekend, is that Lawson has largely been in the shadows. When I mentioned that Colapinto had been doing very well lately, a lot of people were quick to go, but what about Liam? As Motorsport magazine mentioned, memories in F1 are short, and because Colapinto and Behrman have come in and done well immediately, Lawson's 12-ish months in waiting for a drive again have seen his return be overshadowed by those two. And while Behrman and Colapinto were thrown in with very little notice due to being needed out of necessity, Behrman needed because of Sainz's appendix and then the ban to Magnussen, and Williams needing to offload a driver for the reasons that they cite, Lawson had a month to get ready and was there as part of a use me or lose me contract clause. But no denying that he did well. In the first qualifying session, he was 3rd, but his engine penalty was going to undo everything anyway. But even still, 19th to 9th. Not bad in that car, and ahead of Yuki to boot. And there was some clickbait going around recently basically saying that Perez was going to announce his retirement at the Mexican Grand Prix, and this might allow for Lawson to get an instant promotion or allow for Daniel Ricciardo to come back in some fashion. But Perez has since shut down any of those rumours with a Twitter video, YouTube short or Instagram reel basically saying, "I'm not going anywhere." But at the same time, this is Red Bull. They could change that if his performances still continue to be bad and Lawson continues to outdo Tsunoda. So what do I think? It is a tricky situation. I reckon Sauber will take either Bottas or Colapinto, with Bortoletto being a consideration, and then Lawson stays at RB for the 2025 season and goes up when Perez's contract ends. But I'll end up being wrong. You watch. And I know that after the fact people love to come back to videos and go, well, this aged like milk. But that's the thing. We're dealing with an unpredictable sport, and at the same time, an unpredictable team in Red Bull/RB. And as a very wise man once said, anything can happen in Formula 1, and it usually does. But I'd like to know what you think in the designated comment and opinion submission zone directly underneath this video. So then, this has been a piece on where I think the driver market might go in the final 5 races of the season, as we still have one seat that's up for grabs for 4, maybe 5 people, and the second seat almost being based around what Red Bull does with Perez. If this video has given you some food for thought, then do click that thumbs up button so I know I've done a good job. And for more stuff from this channel, get subscribed and also get that bell on so you never miss out on any future videos. Massive thanks as ever go out to the mad lads at Patreon for the continued support, and if you want to help support me at a more personal level, then a link to Patreon will be in the description, along with links to Discord, socials and other bits and pieces you might want or need to know. Well, there's super thanks if you just want to top up my coffee cup, and memberships for those that want to do Patreon but without the whole Patreon thing. So until next time, I've been AdmiralLaWind, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.